Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Maybe it's even good night for you. Welcome to this, one of the last Ask the Expert sessions on insider risk. Don't lose sleep over insider risk. Use the power of ML to identify and reduce your risk today. My name is Francois van Hemert, and I will be your moderator today. This session is related to the breakout session DB162. And we have a lot of experts, both online and offline, to answer all the questions that you might have. If you want to ask questions, I want to ask you to use the chat function in the client. As I said, we have a team of moderators that will try to answer every single question that comes in. And what they also do is they will forward the questions to our panel, and I'll ask them directly to the people in our panel. We do have to realize that it depends on the volume of questions if they can really answer everything. So if we can't, I apologize up front. If you see a question that you really like, give it a thumbs up. And what happens is that it becomes a prioritized question, and we can then certainly bring it to the attention of our panel. I want you to tell you that this session and all the questions and answers will be recorded. If you do not feel fine with the recording, please leave the session right now and join offline. I want to ask you to help our moderators and be as efficient as possible. Do not spam the Q&A channel and do not post any inappropriate messages. We have a code of conduct for the whole event, the Microsoft Code of Conduct, and I'd like to ask you to adhere to that code of conduct. So here's our experts. The people on our team, and I would like to give them the floor to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Leon and work our way to the right side. Leon, the floor is yours if you're off mute.
Thanks, Francois. So I'm Leon Butler. I'm a security and compliance technical specialist from our UK team. So working with our customers to help them address their security and compliance posture with Microsoft 365.
Thank you. Abbas.
Hello, everyone. I'm Abbas Kudrati, and I'm Asia Pacific Chief Cybersecurity Advisor based in Melbourne, Australia.
Thank you. Charles.
Hey, everyone. I'm part of the cybersecurity area solution. In the global black belt team, specialized in advanced compliance, where we can put a lot of things. So I think Steve might also complete what I'm saying, but it's not about only compliance, also around risk management, data protection, and so on.
Thank you.
Yes. So absolutely. I'm Steve Vandenberg, and I'm an advanced compliance global black belt with Security Solutions area. I help customers with all aspects of our advanced compliance stack, information protection, governance, e-discovery, and also insider risk management. Pleasure to join you today.
Thank you, Steve. So let's get started on the questions that we have. And first I want to address Leon. Leon, the session that we watched talked both about insider risk management and communication compliance. I'm seeing some overlap, but there's also distinct features. Could you maybe, in a few words, explain what the significant differences are between those two products?
Absolutely. So if we tackle communication compliance first. So communication compliance is almost what it says it is. It's a mechanism for you to conduct an element of surveillance of your employees as they use the communication tools in Microsoft 365. So that is Exchange Online, so their email, Teams, Skype for Business, and also Yammer. Insider risk is complementary to surveilling and supervising your teams, in that what it does is start to look at the activity your users are doing and predict an element of risk based on providing you with contextual signals so that you can understand the type of behavior your user is doing and whether or not that poses a risk. So consider one, looking at risk within your organization and a deviation to your policies that secure what people can do. Whereas communication compliance is that insight as to whether or not your employees are communicating in a way that suits your organizational standards of conduct.
Thank you, Leon. I want to switch over to Charles. Charles, why is insider. Why do you need insider risk management if you already have DLP? Can you just not prevent anything happening, of bad things happening by creating a good policy?
I think we can use insider risk management both for piloting and also looking at events. And it's not only preventing things, because DLP is only preventing things, but on the device and preventing on Office 365. But with insider risk management, we are going a step behind, and also looking at the user activity, aggregating a lot of signals, also from an HR perspective. We are merging all these, aggregating these signals and launching, triggering some things to do some kind of investigation. So where DLP is blocking or warning, sending some notification, it's not really aggregating all these signals. So we need that dashboard, and that dashboard is it's only a tool. It's only a tool to support a full insider threat program. So I really think that this insider risk management is in the middle of this whole process of classifying, protecting through the DLP rules, and then moving forward to a more content search discovery thing.
Thank you. Next, we'll switch over to Abbas. Abbas, a question from Andre. What are the most difficult insider threats that you want to stop, and how does Microsoft address these in information risk management?
Yeah, sure.
Insider risk management, sorry.
So the most difficult use case, if you notice, for the insider risk is unknowingly or knowingly sharing the data outside the organization, or giving the data or sharing the information to the wrong recipient. That's the most difficult one, I would say, as a use case. And the way to manage is there are it's a multifold solutions or technique is. First, you should have a good data classification practice in place, so you know what data are classified and how they are classified and how they are tagged. For that, our information management comes into picture. But from the insider risk management point of view, you need to have a good monitoring system in terms of user behavior. Is the same user making the similar mistakes on and on? Based on that, our system gives them a risk score, and accordingly, it flags upon it. So having a good behavior analytics engine and having the analytics or the correlation of the data in terms of which data has passed on or leaked from which particular tool set, could be through a USB, could be through the email, or could be through a web upload, or uploading onto Dropbox or OneDrive, or could be through a printer. There are a number of use cases which we can see it as a part of our solution.
Thank you, Abbas. Steve, next question will be for you. Say I configured a lot of policies and a lot of scenarios within insider risk management. How do I make sure that it's working and that I don't get a false sense of security?
Sure. So, of course, what we're going to want to do is during the deployment and periodically thereafter, we're going to be, testing the solution, using it to, correlate signal within our environment. Also recognize that all of our advanced compliance solutions have visibility into each other. Microsoft information protection, data loss prevention, and insider risk. So what we're going to be able to do is look at the alerts that are raised. We're going to be able to look at the content, which is to say the files that are issues at issue, and then go ahead and look at the other advanced compliance systems to see that correlation and make sure that we're getting all of our alerts triggered like they should, both the out-of-the-box policies and the custom policies that you can configure for your own organization's use cases.
Thank you, Steve. Let's see. Let's switch over to Leon now. Leon, we've learned that there are many signals that come into insider risk, but also external ones. We already had the HR connector, but we've recently announced the what we call priority physical assets connector. Can you give me a bit more information on that and what it does?
Yeah, absolutely. So the connectors that we're building into insider risk are helping to bring those triggers and those contextual signals in from external solutions. Okay, so we've already got the HR connector, which looks initially at the resignation and leavers sort of process within your HR service. That's getting expanded with grievances and other compelling events that happen with users like probation, personal improvement plans, and so on. The other connector, which is around physical access, is one of the other components that puts the context into a user's behavior into view. And that is that if I'm using my badge, my physical badge, to authenticate myself into different parts of the business, the pattern that I may observe may also put the rest of my activity into a different context. And that's what that connector is doing. So it's behaving very similar to a HR connector, but in this circumstance, what it is then doing is taking the signals through from a badge system to show where a user has physically interacted. These physical locations can then be determined as priority locations of where a user wants to then be monitored. So for example, if I go into a highly sensitive part of our office, so I've badged in, that gives me the signal that I've gone somewhere that is highly sensitive. The activity that then follows may be exfiltration of data down to USB, printing, copying to file shares, and so on. Because I've gone into a highly sensitive area and done that, that gives me that different context that potentially I'm doing something that I perhaps shouldn't and therefore represents a risk. Equally, those physical locations could also follow the fact that I've handed my notice in. So should someone who's on notice be going in these different physical locations? So it's all about taking those external factors and influences to bringing in that M365 and endpoint signals into greater context.
Thank you, Leon. I do have a follow-up question on that is very strictly related. What if a customer has signals that they want to feed into the insider risk management tool? Can they build their own connectors?
So at the moment, we're supporting just those two connectors, which pull in those external factors. Insider risk today is evolving as a platform. So originally we didn't really have too much of the external influence. We're starting to grow that over time. So right now we can't bring those signals in directly to insider risk management, but there is potential and opportunity to start thinking outside of the box in terms of how we can take some of those signals into different parts of our platform. So maybe taking that into Azure Sentinel as our SIEM service, and then aggregating some of our signals from insider risk into Sentinel and having much more of a holistic approach to deriving risk across a variety of different platforms in one place.
Thank you. Switching over to Abbas. Abbas, if we look at insider risk management, we are tracking, or Microsoft is tracking, a lot of information on what is happening in the organization. And I can imagine that there are a lot of privacy concerns with respect to users, with respect to what they're doing. How would you address that, and how can you make sure that we still respect the privacy of the users within an organization?
So I would like to give an example of my own company where I used to work before joining Microsoft. So we had a challenge when we implemented our new web application firewall. As for an example, we wanted to monitor in terms of what kind of discussions are going around within the company on the Skype, and also we want to see what kind of website the users are browsing. However, because of the internal security and internal privacy policy, we were not able to implement those control effectively. And that goes back to your question. First of all, is do we have our policy up to date and have a concurrence from the user that we have a monitoring system in place and we would like to monitor for the benefit of the business? That's the first thing. Second thing is education on the people side. We want to educate our employee that we are going to do this kind of monitoring at that level of activity. Third being do we have any regulatory or a compliance requirement because of a loss of the land, or because of any policy from the government side, or any regulatory body which mandates you that we have to do a monitoring at the level so that our data is not leaked? Last but not the least is on the side that we need to make sure that the product what we are using is in compliant with various regulatory which we are bound to it. For example, if I'm going to use information risk management or insider risk management solution, then I want to know whether this product or a service has been passed through GDPR or ISO or NIST kind of all the assessment, so that I have a assurance that nobody else from the vendor side is going to monitor or take the data which we have within the company for our employee.
Thank you, Abbas. Switching gears a little and now moving over to communication compliance. And I want to address a question to Steve. Steve, if you want to get started with your rollout on communication compliance, and I do want to get started, but I don't want to be affecting all my users, I just want to get to know, what would be the best way to get started on implementing a tool like communication compliance?
Sure. So we can absolutely deploy any of these solutions to a small group of users within the organization. Typically, what we would do is we would start with a proof of concept with a friendly group of users, one that would be able to provide us good feedback, tune our policies and so forth. Definitely start with the out-of-the-box policies to take that all of that learning that Microsoft has done, including rolling these solutions out inside of our own company, all the experience that we've harvested from our other customers, and then we have the ability to then bring on other users, as we develop confidence in the solution. Well, I would definitely recommend deploying into the production environment. There's not much advantage here to deploying in a sandbox with users that don't have behaviors that we find value in from a point of view of looking at that signal and gaining experience with these solutions.
Great, thank you. Switching over to Charles. Charles, if you look at communication compliance, what would be the typical scenarios that customers start with communication compliance? What would be a typical question from a customer that triggers, now you need to know, now you need to use communication compliance?
So based on the discussion I had previously, and I had another customer this week who told me about his typical approach, I would trigger two things. The first one is the immediate research or the immediate policy that we want to put in place is the analysis of the offensive language. Anything that is deviating from the ethical or the standards that the company is providing is really an appealing scenario. But it's not only about being rude with your employee or being rude with your manager and so on. It's also about turning policies to look at what's being done in the business. If I take an example, and this is this week example, I've got an ask from an insurance and who is working also with financial and banking traders, and these people wanted to prevent a specific team to discuss with external marketing players, and there is a full list of people that are authorized to discuss with these people, and above that list, you can't, as a trader, you cannot discuss with these external influencers, because it can have an impact on your decision, and you need to be influenced by only the people in the list. So if someone is triggering a specific name of that list, then communication compliance is firing up. So it's, as you see, it's not only about offensive language analysis, but also about complying with your existing requirements in your existing business.
Thank you, Charles. Switching to Leon. Leon, I got a question right out of I think it's a famous book. Who is watching the watchers? How do we detect and report potential unprofessional behavior by the people that are watching the people that for professional behavior?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, from an admin perspective, they are users in the sense of what they're doing. So any of their interactions with files and communication, that absolutely falls under insider risk and communication compliance. But quite rightly, how do we detect users that are abusing their privilege? So one of the key things to observe when you're thinking around these watchers, so your privileged users, is start to think of the process by which you're giving out these privileged rights. So privileged identity management is quite critical for all customers when they're considering their M365 rollout. So give people the least amount of privileges to do their job for the least amount of time that is required. So almost having no standing privileges where you can. Now, granted, you can't do that in totality for global admins, but you shouldn't have a lot of global admins. There's no need for someone to have sustained global admin privileges. So that's very, very key as a first point. The second is to leverage the audit log to understand what your administrative and privilege roles are doing. All user activity or administrative activity is logged. You can create alerts either within the auditing within Office 365 or through Cloud App Security to determine when certain users and certain privileged functions have been executed. For example, if someone goes ahead and runs an e-discovery case to do some form of investigation for governance or litigation, that should trigger an alert, because e-discovery is a god right. It overcomes a lot of permissions. Very, very similar with the likes of insider risk communication compliance. When anybody makes a change, ensure you have sufficient alerting to detect that has happened. So with the audit log, with Cloud App Security, then also ensure you've got a privileged workflow that ensures that users are only getting the right privileges for the right amount of time, do the right job.
Thank you, Leon. Steve, question for you. We heard a lot about the feature to anonymize user data within insider risk management. And the question I got is, but how can I investigate if I don't know who is this about?
Sure. So good question. Now, someone in the organization, an investigator, is going to likely be able to discern who they are looking at from the content. Remember, we are making the content visible to the investigator in its native form. Now, the anonymization feature is available, which is to say we can toggle this feature on and off. But where we want the anonymization feature, we're looking at, protecting people's privacy at a high level. Of course, innocent until proven guilty. And we're also wanting to remove any bias from the system. So we recognize that if I'm, say, looking at an alert that is associated with a colleague, I may be, biased in the action that I take. In theory, the whole watching the watcher question, could I then put them on to the fact that they are under investigation and so on? So we have the anonymization feature there for that purpose. At the same time, we recognize that, some organizations will want to have that on, some will want to have it off. If we have it off, we don't anonymize, then we give the analyst the ability to leverage the fact that Azure Active Directory has, or I should say, Insider Risk has visibility into Active Directory, and we can look at the relationship between people in the company. We can look at the position of the individual for context. So again, we have that as an option. we do have to recognize that since we have visibility into the content for the analyst, they may be able to discern, the people associated with the alerts in any case.
Thank you, Steve.
I may want to add something, Francois, about this
Sure.
specifically. Usually, when you are treating this kind of that kind of information, you are staying at that insider risk level analysis, which is a bit different from the people who will be looking at the content from an e-discovery perspective, from a legal standpoint. And from the insiders management dashboard, you can click on the escalation button where the user is becoming an anonymized. And then you are entering that EDRM, that e-discovery process, where you are obliged to or notify the user that is put on hold, and then you start digging into more information that permits you to identify this particular custodian. So I would say that the next step to that question is, and also the recommendation is, keep that pseudonymization button on in insiders management, then switch to a known and named user case analysis into advanced discovery theme.
Thank you. Great addition. Switching over to Abbas, because I think if it's about education, it's about Abbas. The question I got, Abbas, was, I'm an education customer and I'm worried about what my students may have been saying to each other using Teams. Would communication compliance help us with this? How is this different from communication DLP?
Yep, absolutely. Great question, and very relevant to me, because I'm also a part-time professor in university where I teach. And these days, because of COVID, everything is online. So that's something which my company has, my university where I teach has implemented, and they are seeing a great advantage of that. So difference is, from the DLP point of view, it's more about the communication. DLP is more about data leakage, but here we are trying to see what kind of behavior and the context behind what discussion are being going around. One good example, it could be maybe two friends are talking and they are very friendly and they may be using a swear language very commonly while on the chat on the Teams, right? So our system can pick up that kind of a behavior, that this is normal between those two people when they are using a chat. But if there is a history behind them, or there is some different context which they haven't used this kind of word before, and now they are trying to use and using those swear words, means something is wrong. And that will be picked up because of a machine learning what we have and kind of intelligence which we have within our system. So it goes a long way. And one typical use case I would like to add, since you asked me, is especially when during the exam period, when people are talking about the question answers and leakage of the information and the exam papers. That's something really helping us to catch whether what could be the reason why these things are going around. It can be flagged because of the person who is talking about this kind of information has a previous history in stealing some of the data or trying to hack internal systems of the university. It goes a long way.
Thank you, Abbas. Yeah, and I think that is a very real topic that we're seeing nowadays. We're nearing the end of the session. I want to ask one last question. Leon, if we, listening to the story, one of our attendees asks, it looks like it's only for Windows 10. How about other users? How about mobile devices?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk insider risk and indeed communication compliance, for the most part, the signals that are generated at a service level. So when we look at insider risk, the data leakage, the data loss, the communications that users take that contribute to that risk assessment, they're service side. So there's no relation to the endpoint at that particular time. The only point where Windows 10 comes into it is when we start to look at what happens on the device itself. So if we're looking at printing, USB, and file share activity that happens on the device, we are dependent on Windows 10 for that, because that's where we have our endpoint DLP capabilities that are built into effectively the Windows 10 kernel, so no agents, etc. But we're dependent on the OS at that point. But that's one segment of insider risk. The rest is all done service side. So you're sharing files and you're downloading files from SharePoint, for example, you're sending an email, you're sending an IM in Teams. We do that at a device agnostic level. So whether you've done that through an iOS device, an Android device, and so on, it's agnostic to that. So just think the downloading is where it's done at the endpoint level.
Thanks, Leon, for a great clarification. And with that, we are at the end of our session. I really want to thank you all, Leon, Abbas, Charles, Steve, for your insight and for your knowledge that you shared. But I also want to give a special thanks to the people who are working behind the screens. We have Anders and we have Erica, who have been diligent at answering the questions. And of course, we also have our producer who has been so kind to help us on setting up the video. I really want to thank you all for attending this session. I hope it was useful to you. I have some links and some information on the screen. Go check out the links, go work with Insider Risk, and maybe engage in the learning path. And with that, I want to wish you a very good day, and I hope you have a great Ignite for what's left. Thank you very much.